Secondly, God is in work in your life too. You say, well, wow, Moses was different. I mean, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house. I mean, God made sure that Moses wasn't killed. He was taken into Pharaoh's house. He grew up there. He was a man of privilege. And all of the things that God could have done to preserve Moses, he did that. What do you think God's done in your life? God brought you into this world, didn't he? God has placed you in a position which may not be the position you want to be in because you're trying to do it by the world standards, but there is no doubt in my mind that God has placed you in a position to serve him if you've been listening and watching what God is doing. Because the reality is, God had a purpose that he wanted to accomplish through Moses' life. And in Moses' world, even though Moses was in exile in the backside of the desert because he had disobeyed God the first time. You realize that? God had placed him in that position. But Moses became angry about what was happening to the children of God. And he struck the man down. And he was placed into exile in the backside of the desert. Now, folks, disobedience to God's will get you in places that the Bible simply refers to as to Moses on the backside of the desert. Do you know what that means? You go as far as you know where to go, and you have to go a little further. Have you ever been in the backside of the desert? Maybe some of you are there right now. You don't even know if God knows where you're at. You've gotten so far away. Being on the backside of the desert gives us the idea that he had gone as far as he could go, and he took a few steps further. He was in places where he had never been before. He was in circumstances he had never been there before. Now, what happens in our life is that when God is about to do something in our life, oftentimes he will bring us to a place, if we are his, where we have to surrender the things that we're comfortable with in order to hear what God says. Now, really, it's a lot easier to hear what God says in our life if we will just hear him and do what he asks us to do and join him in what he is doing. But unfortunately, in some of our lives, we don't hear well. We ignore well. And we always believe it's somebody else that God's speaking to, don't we? That's not the case. When God wants to do something, remember what I said? We know it's God speaking. And we know what we must do in response to that, right? We know what God is saying. But disobedience and not experiencing God means that we try to get away from that and we move out into the desert. Now, he was in exile. God had a purpose. God had heard his people. God had not intended for his people to stay in Egypt that long. He heard the cries of his people. He knew the abuse of his people. And God had chosen to deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt back into the promised land. He said, it's long enough. It's long enough. You say, well, man, they were just a bunch of godly people and they just wanted to do everything that God wanted to do. Yeah. And they spent 40 years of wilderness wandering and only 2 of them made it in because every one of them disobeyed God. It wasn't because they were good. It was because that God had chosen to take his people and to bring them into a promised land. Just because we bear the name of Christ, folks, doesn't mean that we are perfect in what God is doing. Matter of fact, we're probably far from it. Most all of us are. But God still uses. God had a plan for him. He hadn't forgotten his people. God hadn't forgotten you folks. And God had a purpose, and he was going to deliver them. Now what happened was God initiated that deliverance. And God initiated and maintained that love relationship with his people that was real and personal. And God wanted to use them. And God wants to use you if you bear his name. He knows who you are. He knows where you are. He knows what the problem is. And you can't tell God anything about yourself that he doesn't know. He knows your abilities. He knows your inabilities. He knows your fears. He knows your willingness. He knows your unwillingness. He knows your stubbornness. He knows all of those things about you. But the amazing thing about it is, God still loves you. And God was still willing to send His Son to die for you. Because He has chosen to use you to accomplish His will here on this earth, folks. He wants to. If perfection was a prerequisite to God's blessings, we would all be in a heap of trouble. Because all you Kentucky Wildcat fans would never know a blessing. I got your attention now, then. Okay. I know it. Okay. You see, it is not a prerequisite, folks. Even some of us that like orange can be blessed. God knows our hearts. And God pursues that relationship. I want you to notice in verse 12 what He says. In verse 12. He answered. And this is what Moses, I will certainly be with you, God did. And this will be the sign to you that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain. Point it over there. In verse 14, he was saying, verse 12, I will be with you. In verse 14, he said what? Who should I tell him sent me? Moses had questions. He gave him that wonderful answer, I am. Jesus reiterated that in the Gospel of John, didn't he? In those times when he said, I am. What he was saying is, Moses, you tell him that the God of all things, the God of all purposes, the God of all needs, the God in control, says, I'll be with you. I'm the one that's calling him out. Wow. You don't have to know the plan, do you? He said, you just go in. This is what you're to do. And you're to trust me because I am that I am. I am everything you'll ever need in every circumstance you'll ever need, Moses. And if you will trust me, because I'm the one that can make a bush burn without being consumed. I'm the one that can deliver you as a child and bring you to this place in time. I am the one who has known your life, just as Steve has shared with us this morning. I brought your life into existence. Your life belongs to me. And if you have given your life to me, Moses, today, I want you to join me in what I'm doing. I'm bringing my people out of this place. There's people out there in bondage, folks. God wants you to use you to deliver them. There are situations and circumstances of things that God wants to do with you. Now, how God did that is very simple. Just as I mentioned the very first Sunday that we talked about this, God pursues a love relationship with us. He had pursued a love relationship with Moses. Moses was learning and getting some education in the desert, but God loved him. And God wanted to continue to love him and to understand him. And God, he sought that love relationship with Moses. Now, it wasn't just something Moses had heard about. God was out there with Moses. It was real. And it was very personal, folks. It wasn't just something that somebody else had. It was a personal relationship with Moses. And furthermore, folks, not only does God pursue that love relationship with people like Moses, God pursues a love relationship with you, which He also wants to be real and personal. He does that.